Welcome. This is the mini lecture for Chapter 10, Introduction to Economic Fluctuations. This chapter is, at least it seems to me, not that complicated. Pretty straightforward stuff. But I want to make very clear to you that even though this chapter is not hard, that's not the same as unimportant. In some ways, this is the most important chapter in the textbook. This chapter introduces the core difference between many models of the macroeconomy. In particular, how prices change. This has profound implications for economic policy. So, let's get into it. Let's see. First, time horizons. Long run, short run. Different economic models, macroeconomic models, usually make different assumptions about how easily prices can change. That I can't tell you how fundamental that idea is to macroeconomic modeling. We all agree that in the long run, prices can change. They're flexible. And in the short run, they can't change. They're not flexible. We use the term sticky. In the short run, prices are sticky. They are stuck where they are. Now, if we all agree on this, how do we have different assumptions? Well, it depends on what you mean by long run and short run. Imagine economic circumstances change, and so there's a new equilibrium. And that new equilibrium includes a new equilibrium price. No matter how hard it is to change prices, if you give the market enough time, maybe a year, maybe 100 years, maybe 1,000 years, eventually prices will reach the new equilibrium. Imagine you're in a country where it's just against the law to change prices. Well, if you wait long enough, that government will go away. The market will still be there. So however you define the long run, if you wait long enough, prices will change and they will reach the new equilibrium. In the short run, imagine the short run as the extreme case, a millionth of a second. If something changes to create a new equilibrium price, like a law changes and is set to go into effect, changing tax rates at exactly 12:01 p.m. Eastern Standard Time on January 9th, whatever. Prices will not go to that new equilibrium instantly. At best, it would take a fraction of a second, even on the New York Stock Exchange, where prices change, where they have supercomputers running. Prices take a fraction of a second to reach the new equilibrium. If nothing else, limited by the speed of light or the signals. So we know in a millionth of a second, prices will not change. They're fixed at a certain level. The other extreme, give it 1,000 years, prices will change. The question is disagreement about where in the gray area different economic systems are. How sticky are prices in more normal time frames, a week, a month, a year? How flexible are they? This makes a big difference in economic models. Let's take a look. Okay. First, the neoclassical model of the macroeconomy, it says that output is determined by things on the supply side. Let's see, I can actually draw that. Here's something simple. Output is some function of capital and labor. Capital is exogenous to that model. Labor is exogenous to that model. These are inputs. Capital, labor, technology. That determines output. If you have a fixed level of capital and a fixed level of labor, and throw in a fixed level of technology, then output is fixed. Supply, demand don't change how much stuff is produced. Real things produce, real inputs determine output. Changes in nominal variables, like, if I can get the right pen, there we go. Demand, prices, these things don't change output. Consumption, investment, government, they don't change production, because production is only a function of capital, labor, technology, the inputs. This model assumes prices are free to change. It assumes price flexibility. Therefore, this model should be accurate if you wait long enough for prices to change. How long is that? We disagree. Let's look at the other case. You can have another model where output is not determined by capital and labor. It's determined by fiscal policy. How much will government take? How much will government tax? Monetary policy. How big will the money supply be? And other factors like changes in consumption or investment preferences. Let's see. You can compare these simple models, but with two very different assumptions, whether prices can or can't change. With a model of aggregate demand and aggregate supply. It's a very basic model. It's essentially the supply and demand model you've seen in principles, except instead of supply of apples, demand for apples, price of apples, it's supply of generic units of output, demand for generic units of output, and a price for generic units of output. That's just the price level. Let's see. Okay. Here we go. Aggregate demand. Well, in a regular, from a particular market supply and demand graph, on the horizontal axis, you have quantity of that thing, quantity of apples, price of apples. But here we're dealing with generic units of output. So this is output. Oops, I'm in the way. And this is the price of output, the price level. Well, if people have a certain real money balance, enough cash to buy something, well, if prices are low, then they'll be able to buy a large fraction of output with that real money balance. If prices are high, with the same amount of cash, they won't be able to buy as much. Thus, you have a downward sloping aggregate demand curve. How can this curve shift? If the money supply increases, then you'll have more cash. Pretty straightforward. Imagine the Fed decides to fly a helicopter over the United States and shovel out $100 bills out the back. Well, you now have more cash. You are capable of buying a larger fraction of the economy. So at the same price level, let's see, there we go. At the same price level, you used to only be able to buy that much stuff, generic units of output. Now, you can buy that much. Not terribly complicated. Okay. Now let's go to supply. In the long run, aggregate supply is determined by real variables. Total output is a function of capital and labor. That's it. Now, in the long run, therefore, on this model of price versus quantity, the price level, quantity of generic output, there is nothing on either of these axes that says anything about how much output should be, because it's determined by variables that are not included on this graph. How much capital you have, how much labor you have. Given a certain fixed level of capital and labor, you're going to have a fixed level of output. The price level doesn't change that. So, if capital and labor are fixed, in the long run, your output's going to be fixed. The quantity of generic units of output is not going to change. Low price, high price makes no difference. The supply curve is vertical. Notice LRAS, long run aggregate supply. Here we go. So, in the long run, if you were to increase the money supply, for example, if you were to increase aggregate demand through any process, let's just assume an easy example, an increase in the money supply. Well, then you'd start at this equilibrium between aggregate demand and long-run aggregate supply, price level P1, output level that. Then, if the aggregate demand shifts right, you shift to this new equilibrium. Output stays the same. You just get an increase in price. This fits with the quantity theory of money. If all of a sudden we were all knee-deep in $100 bills because the Fed went nuts, that doesn't mean we're any richer. We don't have any more stuff. It's just going to mean the price of everything is going to go up. In the long run, that's what happens. Let's see. However, we don't live in the long run. We live in the short run. In the short run, the extreme case, we assume prices can't change at all. So, in the short run, we assume prices are fixed at this level. So the short-run aggregate supply curve is not vertical. In the extreme case, it's horizontal. So firms will sell any amount, small amount, large amount of generic units of output. They'll sell as much as the demand side demands, all at the same price. This means that total output is not determined by the supply side, the long run. It's determined by the demand side in the short run. Here, If you assume prices are fixed in the short run, and you have, therefore, a horizontal short-run aggregate supply curve, well, if you shift demand right, increase aggregate demand in any manner, you're going to go from this equilibrium to this equilibrium. Prices don't go up because we've defined this time period as one that's brief enough that prices can't change. They haven't had time to change. Therefore, you're just going to have an increase in output. So in the short run, this predicts that if the Federal Reserve went insane and started flying a helicopter all across the United States, shoveling $100 bills out the back as fast as they could, in the short run, that would make us actually richer. Prices would not go up. Let me give you a little preview of an intuition of how that would work. Let's assume that you live in a small town and you find a bag with $1 million in it, whatever. And every day, the local business in town, whatever it is, you buy, 2 or 3 little things. But today, you go in and you buy a whole bunch of stuff because you've got this bag of money. That business owner is going to think, wow, business is great. Maybe I should increase output. And so that business would increase output, and total production of stuff would increase. It's a question of information flow. It gets to the Lucas Island model. That comes later. All right. So these two models, whether you think that prices can change or can't change in any particular length of time, let you make predictions, short run and long run. Well, we know the short run happens first and the long run happens later, however you define those time frames. So let's assume that we have this long run aggregate supply curve, vertical, this short run aggregate supply curve, horizontal, and these two aggregate demand curves. The first one and the second one. Something happens to increase demand, shift it right. Okay, we start out, let's see, I'll use another color because I feel like it. There we go. We start out at the equilibrium. That's where the first aggregate demand curve and the short run aggregate supply curve cross. Point A. That gives us price level that and output that. Now, aggregate demand increases, shifts right. In the short run, prices can't change, so we're going to stay on this short run aggregate supply curve, which means we move to that equilibrium, B. In the short run, an increase in demand increases output, but does not increase price. But then time passes. We know that eventually we will move from the short run aggregate supply curve to the long run aggregate supply curve. Because in the long run, output is not a function of demand. It's a function of real variables like capital and labor. So, after we reach the long run, whenever that is, we will be at the intersection of the long run aggregate supply curve and aggregate demand curve 2. Point C. Well, that means the pattern of motion is going to be from A to B. That will happen instantaneously as some shock instantly moves demand right. That's a big assumption that happens instantaneously, but it simplifies things. People wake up one morning, all of a sudden they decide they want to buy more. Doesn't matter why. But then over time, as we move from the short run to the, if I can draw it, from the short run to the long run, we will move from B to C. Output will fall back down to its natural level, determined by capital and labor. Prices will change. Prices will go up. Let's see. All right, we can analyze the same thing if all of a sudden, for some reason, demand falls. We would start at the intersection of short-run aggregate supply and aggregate demand 1. At point A, all of a sudden, demand, for whatever reason, shifts down left. In the short run, output will fall. This is a recession. But if you wait, give prices enough time to change, however long that takes, you move to C, where you're back on the long-run aggregate supply curve. Output's at its natural level, determined by capital and labor, and just prices have fallen. Okay, those are changes in aggregate demand, but sometimes there are also supply shocks. The supply curve can change suddenly. Good examples, bad weather. All of a sudden, crops are destroyed. Prices of output change. Good example, in the 1970s, the Arab oil embargo, when the OPEC, Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, was then, as it is now, mostly, although not entirely, composed of Arab countries in the Middle East. There was a war in the Middle East between Israel and its Arab neighbors. The United States supported Israel. The Arab neighbors didn't like that. They acted through OPEC by restricting the supply of petroleum to the United States. In the press, it was called the Arab oil embargo. So, all of a sudden, the supply of oil dropped, and fossil fuels were a fundamentally important part of production of pretty much everything at the time. So, here's a model. We start out with the economy stationary, meaning that the short run and the long run aggregate supplies are the same. The economy hasn't changed in a million years. There is no motion. So we are at equilibrium point A. Notice that my point is that we are on the short run aggregate supply curve. We are also on the long run aggregate supply curve. So we're at the intersection with both of those, with aggregate demand. Now, we're assuming here that demand doesn't change. It's a supply shock. We're assuming that the short run aggregate supply shifts to here. So, short run, going to be the intersection of aggregate demand and the first short run aggregate supply. supply curve. That's at point A, which is also long-run equilibrium. All of a sudden, OPEC turns off the oil export valves. The price of oil, and you can think of that as a proxy for the price of output in general, because it's such a fundamental part of production, and more so then than now even. So the price all of a sudden spikes up. The aggregate supply curve shifts up. The price level goes from P1 to P2. That takes us from A to B. But now, so the output has dropped and the price level has gone up. But we're not on the long run aggregate supply curve anymore. Over time, we are going to move back to it. Prices will adjust to take us back to A. So, in the short run, you should see prices go up. You should see output go down. And because output falls, unemployment's going to go up. But over time, the economy should adjust to that, and it will. And you can look at these in greater detail on your own. These predictions, inflation should go up, output should go down, and unemployment should go up. And then over time, those effects should dissipate. That is what we saw. Now, if you assume that prices are flexible, that it's the long run that dominates, then the only thing that can increase, we're in a recession, let's say. People are screaming for the government to do something, fix it. If you assume the economy is in its long-run equilibrium, then the only thing you can do to increase output is increase capital or labor or technology. This is the core of what's called real business cycle theory. Economists who believe that recessions, the business cycle, good times, bad times, that they're caused by real factors, real changes in labor, either quality or quantity, real changes in capital, technological breakthroughs. But if you believe you're in the long run, or you're a follower of real business cycle theory, then changing things that do not affect the long run equilibrium, monetary policy, fiscal policy, they're not going to work. But if you believe that prices are sticky to some extent, then you can manipulate aggregate demand with fiscal or monetary policy. And at least in the short run, you can change output. So if you're in a recession, that's why in a recession, you frequently hear the government talk about stimulus spending. The government should borrow a bunch of money, spend it on all sorts of stuff. It'll stimulate the economy, get us out of the recession. Well, that's predicated on the assumption that prices are sticky. Now, no economist thinks prices are perfectly sticky or perfectly flexible. But the degree to which you believe prices are sticky is the degree to which this kind of stabilization policy, manipulating output by manipulating monetary fiscal policy, it's the degree to which that will work. If you think prices are only a little sticky, changing the money supply or fiscal policy only change output a little bit, for example. Now, let's see. The easiest example of this in action is a change in monetary policy. Even though it's usually fiscal policy the government uses. Monetary policy also, but fiscal gets more attention. Okay. Let's assume that there is an adverse supply shock. So you move from short-run aggregate supply 1 to short-run aggregate supply 2. That takes you from equilibrium A to equilibrium B. Aggregate demand hasn't changed. This is a setup of the problem. Then we'll shift the AD curve to see how it can be dealt with. So in the short run, prices go up, output goes down. You're now off aggregate, long-run aggregate supply. Okay, this change, that output has gone down. The economy is contracting. That's the definition of a recession. People are unemployed, not happy, not going to vote for you. So, the government acts. We are here. If you wait for the economy to adjust on its own, you will move back to here over time, the intersection of the aggregate demand curve, AD1, and the long-run aggregate supply curve. But if you aren't willing to wait, you can shift aggregate demand right, increase demand, convince people one way or another to buy more. That could include the government buying more. Simple model, money supply, increase it. AD shifts right. You're still on the short-run aggregate supply curve, short-run aggregate supply 2. But you shift from B, if you increase aggregate demand just the right amount, you can get back to this pre-recession level of output. It'll be at a higher price level, but everybody has their jobs again. The economy looks like, oh, it's recovered. This is the core of a lot of macro theory. How to use changes, deliberately caused changes in aggregate demand, how to manipulate aggregate demand through monetary policy, fiscal policy, etc., to change the short-run output equilibrium so that if in the short run you're in a recession, you can fix it instead of waiting for the long run to fix the problem, to come back to the long run equilibrium. In this model, it works. Does it work in the real world? The answer to that is A, it's complicated, and B, stay tuned. We'll learn about that in future chapters. All right. Thanks for watching.